U.S. restoring sanctions on Iran. President Trump tweeted this earlier. The Iran sanctions have officially been cast. These are the most biting sanctions ever imposed. And in November, they ratchet up to yet another level. Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. I am asking for world peace, nothing less, says the president. Taking effect earlier this morning, the first set of strict economic sanctions include the following. Sanctions on the purchase of U.S. dollar banknotes by Iran's government. Sanctions on Iran's trade in gold. Sanctions on the country's automotive sector. Joining us now is former foreign policy advisor for President George W. Bush and former State Department official Paul Bonicelli. Paul, good to see you this morning. Thanks for weighing in.
Hi, Maria.
Your take on all of these sanctions and the impact that they will have.
I think they're going to have a very important impact on the government of Iran and its relationship with its people. They've known this is coming. They hoped it could have been avoided. It's only the first step, as you mentioned. In November, it gets much worse. And that's part of the president's plan. He wants to, as he did with North Korea, show I'm very reasonable. I'm willing to talk. We can have a new deal. It will be in the interest of the United States and not something the Obama administration did, which is to say the United States is the problem. It'll be you're the problem. And if you want to change, there are rewards for that. And if you don't, there'll be a lot of pain. The administration knows very well that the pressure on Iran is from its own people. And so that's why these sanctions are going to matter. And that's why they're desperate to avoid them and hope Europe can save them, but they cannot save them.
Paul, it's Lindsay Bell here. But are these sanctions really going to bring Iran to the negotiating table? Or are we going to have to wait till November 4th when the sanctions on oil exports really go into effect? And is the goal here really to negotiate, or is it to overthrow the regime?
Well, if I had to bet, I would say that these sanctions now and the ones in November will not work. Because the government of Iran, the mullahs, cannot afford to show any weakness from their cultural perspective. They're far too much in a bubble. So I expect this to go all the way to an unpleasant conclusion, if not a violent one, and they'll probably bring a revolution on themselves before they will ever do what they think is kowtowing. Some people argue that they'll just hunker down and do what they've done before and suffer. That works when you have a population that is subservient and not willing to challenge you. But we already know the Iranian people are willing to challenge them. You have the added pressure of a United States that's determined to defend its interest against a regime that wants to destroy it and its allies. And you have the Saudi Gulf states, or the Sunni Gulf states that are not going to do anything helpful for Iran. In fact, they're going to be a big problem for Iran.
Paul, this is Dagan McDowell. There's a writer for Commentary magazine. He used to write for the Wall Street Journal named Sohrab Ahmari. And he was tweeting yesterday, and I thought this was really interesting, that a lot of individuals and groups who used to advocate reformism and engagement have shifted, subtly so, to the regime can't be reformed camp, which we should welcome and not abuse these newcomers, was his take. And it kind of dovetails with what we've heard when Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, gave that speech at the Reagan Library about describing the Iranian leadership as a bunch of mobsters, if you will, in terms of enriching themselves with the sanctions relief and the money that's flowed from the United States back into Iran and essentially depriving their own people.
No, he's exactly right. Ahmari is exactly right. The Iranian regime that came to power in 1979 has been the same thing it's always been. If you look at the founder, Khomeini, these people are religious fanatics. They believe extreme things about the world, about themselves, about what they consider their enemies. They have never been any different. There have never been any moderates. They cannot have any power in that country. There are a handful of people like Rouhani who are put forward as a moderate so that gullible Westerners who are desperate to avoid aggression or violence or war of any kind can have something to hang on to. That's always been the case here, and it will be the case because there is no such thing as a moderate Iranian in power, and there never will be until there is a new regime.
Yeah. Paul, how do you think the Iranian regime responds now with respect to nuclear arms development? Do they go back to this race to developing a weapon, and if so, how does the U.S. and the rest of the West respond?
I don't think that they can at this point. I think that these sanctions are going to be crippling enough. I think the Europeans are going to give in to the United States position here because they cannot afford to have all of their companies unable to do business with the United States. So the Iranian regime will be stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't really go forward because they don't have the resources to keep going forward. I'm not saying they won't try to make progress on their nuclear program, but they really won't be able to make that much. But they will not do the wise thing and go to the president and say, we need to save face as we find an accommodation with you. That's what the president wants. I mean, people can mock the president's rough diplomacy all they want, but it's clear the pattern is, I'll have a deal with anybody willing to have a serious deal with us. And I understand saving face.
Yeah.
He's going to do that with the Chinese if they're smart enough. He'll do that with the Iranians. But I don't think the Iranian regime is going to be able to do that because its whole reason for existence is to hate and destroy the United States. And the people of Iran don't really agree with that.
Yeah, and we should have known that when we were doing the Iran deal and they were chanting death to America the whole time.
Well, yeah, we should have known that, but we had a president that thought that the problems in the world are caused by the United States and Israel as opposed to being caused by the real bad people that exist.
Yeah. You mentioned China. There seems to be escalating trade tensions, or are you really not sure how to read into this? Because it seems like we're not going to really see any extension of the talks until after September at this point. But Chinese state media this morning is slamming President Trump. A newspaper headlines describing his trade policies as wishful thinking. This coming as Beijing threatens retaliatory tariffs on $60 billion worth of American goods. That was last Friday, Paul. Your response here and where you think we are in terms of the dispute between China and the U.S. on trade.
Right. Well, I speak as a lifelong free trader. I was one of those people 20 years ago that insisted that China joining the WTO and be a part of the commercial world was going to slowly but surely change China. And I, like a lot of people, was wrong. There are the entrenched Chinese leadership, the party leadership, is now much more of a mafia that makes a lot of money in various sectors, whether they're military or party or whatever. But there's also a very strong ideology that they believe they should be leading in their part of the world, if not the entire world, and everybody sort of pays tribute and accepts whatever they want to do as the rightful rulers. That's not going to go away, and so we're playing a game of chicken. I get it. I understand what the president's trying to do because the president recognizes two things. One, the power of the United States is what matters if you want to get your way, and he's improved the economy, and he's using our military and strengthening that. The Chinese, and I said this 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago when he got elected, it's going to take them a long time to understand that it's a different kind of presidency, and they're going to have to find an accommodation. And I think they're going to find a president and his foreign policy leaders willing to make the right concessions for the face saving of China if they are willing to make a new kind of arrangement. And I think we will get there, but we're probably going to have some pain along the way.
Yeah, we'll see if they actually stop the stealing, right? That's the most important thing when it comes to China.
Right.
Yeah. Paul, good to see you this morning. Thanks so much.
You too. Good to be with you.
Paul Bonicelli,